There it is. Okay, Harrison?
Yeah.
There we go. Fantastic. And we are live. Thank you so much for joining me here. I'm really excited to do this. It's been such a pleasure to have you in the chat in last week and back when I did Thornton Hall. Really have enjoyed your insights into sort of the behind the scenes of Nancy Drew and how these games were produced. And super excited to have you here to do some questions.
Yeah, it's been a real treat watching someone who's familiar with game design concepts try to play through the games and where you get stuck versus which things are super easy for you. It's really interesting.
It's been really interesting for me too, and I have some questions for you about that experience of watching someone like me play through the game. But I want to start with some of the questions that the chat had, because there were a bunch of them, unsurprisingly. And actually, I mean, this is a good one to start with. So, how do you think I'm doing?
I think overall you're doing fairly good. At this point, you're definitely stuck.
Yeah.
Like you're at one of the choke points in the game that kind of divides different game chapters, so to speak. And there's one particular thing that's blocking you, and it's the one thing you haven't looked at a hint for yet.
Okay, well that is I think in itself probably a good hint for me to pick up on next time. It's it's really interesting. Like, that makes perfect sense to me. The sort of the construction of the game around, as you say, choke points, where in order to guide a narrative that has a specific forward progress and a like act structure. This is not unlike, I guess, a lot of the adventure games that that Sean and Bill and I have played on Mostly Walking. That like there is a narrative section that has a bunch of puzzles, and the beginning of it feels really rich because there are lots of things that you can do and try to do. And then inevitably you get to the point where you've done everything except for the one thing that you have never figured out to do, and that's what you sort of get stuck on.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the flaws with the way they're designed, is that there's a number of kind of side activities that you can do either before or after those choke points. And if you do them all before, then it ends up being just kind of a straight line rush to the end of the game where it's puzzle after puzzle after puzzle.
Got it.
Because you no longer have side things to do.
Right. Right.
And the ideal way that we hope people play is to do some of the side things while they're doing the core walkthrough things, and then but spread them out over the course of the game.
So I'm curious, like, from your vantage point, knowing the overall structure and what all of those side things are, like, what has been my style of play? Have I like hit more or fewer of those sort of side things than you would expect or hope for somebody at this stage?
I think you've probably hit a few more, not dramatically more. I think most people probably wouldn't have solved as many of the pictures on the tablet yet, or ever, since those are not game critical at all. The very first one is not game critical, but it is game relevant. The other 7 are purely
sort of extra.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see what things you immediately discount as being unable to do, and when that might not necessarily be the case.
That's super interesting. So, I mean, I'm actually really curious, and I'm more curious than I'm interested in spoilers, I guess. Like, don't if you don't want to spoil something fun for me, then don't. But do you have an example of something that I dismissed too soon? You don't have to. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Nothing immediately comes to mind on this playthrough. With Thornton Hall, there was the cell phone charger thing, which you had all the pieces available to you. You just hadn't found them yet, but they were there for you to find.
Right.
And that's one of the tricky things with the Nancy Drew games, is because there are some things where you are blocked from, and if you ask for a hint, it literally says, wait until later in the game, you can't do this yet.
Right.
And so if you're someone that doesn't like to go to the hints, it can be really hard to distinguish which are the things that you need to leave until later and which are the things you just haven't thought about the right way yet, or haven't explored quite thoroughly enough.
No, absolutely. And I imagine that there is a continuum of people when it comes to looking at the hints, and I'm not sure where I fall on that. But like, I don't want to look at them unless I feel like I've explored options pretty. I have some kind of an internal threshold for how much I want to do on my own before I resort to hints. But I certainly appreciate having them there.
Yeah, and I think most people are kind of like that, in that they don't want to resort to the hints until they're really stuck.
Right.
One of the kind of downfalls of our hint system is the way it works is sometimes the hints come in certain orders, and you can get to the point where, okay, I'm stuck, I need a hint, and you hit give me a hint, and it's something you already know.
Right.
And then you have to wait through the countdown timer before you can ask for another one.
I'm actually not sure that I understood that there was a timer system associated with that.
So for some things there are. For basically, each of the hints has certain game logic attached to them, where you have to be at a certain state of the game in order to get that hint, but they're also in a linear order.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you ask for a hint and there's another one that you're available to get right now, there's a timer bar in the give me a hint button that slowly ticks down, and then it becomes enabled again, and you can ask for another one.
Got it.
It's not super long. It's like 20 to 30 seconds or something like that. It's primarily to prevent people from accidentally clicking more than they want to.
Yes. I'm super familiar with that problem. Yeah, but, absolutely.
It also becomes incredibly frustrating when you ask for a hint and it's, oh, that's the one thing I actually already knew.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, I get that. It's interesting, and I've mentioned this before. I don't remember if I was thinking this way back when I did Thornton Hall, but I'm super into physical escape rooms now, and the relationship between Nancy Drew and modern escape rooms is probably stronger than the original digital escape the room games that inspired the first escape rooms. And are you familiar at all with the phenomenon of physical escape rooms?
Yeah, I haven't done any myself. But I've watched the Geek and Sundry escape show, and so observed a bunch of people doing them, and yeah, it's like walking through a Nancy Drew game, because there's so many actual real puzzles, and that's most adventure games are just the lock and key puzzles,
right?
But Nancy Drew actually has real puzzles in it, that you could solve in the physical world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that has always been striking to me about Nancy Drew, is that it plays a lot with presenting puzzles in a physical way, in a way that suggests physical affordances, and really plays with that. Like the gemstone puzzle from today, right, is really about, you have to, it doesn't make any sense unless you think about it literally as a book that's opening and closing.
Right.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I mean, it just strikes me that the hint system that you're describing is also something that I've seen implemented in a bunch of physical escape rooms. The advantage being that if you have a human being watching you, you're much less likely to get information that is like redundant.
Yeah.
But in structure, it works very, very similar a lot of the time. Okay. So I have no knowledge about this. I'm really curious if you do. Question from Noise Crime: why are there only 2 Hardy Boys games? Did that series not sell? And did it change the Nancy Drew formula too much? I don't even know the Hardy Boys games.
I don't either. That was definitely before my time. I do know that Interactive did acquire the license for the Hardy Boys, not terribly long ago, just a couple of years ago. But there weren't any immediate plans to make a Hardy Boys line of games, and now I have no clue what's potentially in the works over there now. So.
Sure. Yeah. Do you, I mean, just like gut reaction, since this wasn't your area of specialty or anything, do you think a Hardy Boys license would appeal to the Nancy Drew audience?
I think on some levels it definitely could. The other issue with it is, I think, is any kind of story or game you could make in the Hardy Boys world, you could also make in the Nancy Drew world.
Right.
And one of the core purposes of Her Interactive when it was founded was to make games that would appeal to girls. And going from a strong female protagonist to a couple of boy protagonists, there's not a lot of value there.
Right.
In what you're trying to do. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. It's interesting that that they acquired that license. It makes me curious about what sorts of things you could do with it other than just a direct like Nancy Drew clone of the Hardy Boys. I bet that there are lots of other things that could be used for. That's super interesting. You're not really particularly familiar with those games that were produced?
No, I didn't even know they existed either.
Yeah, I totally didn't know they existed. I'll have to look them up after this at some point. Interesting. Okay, so a question from Lego Freak for you. What was it like working for Penny Milliken?
So Penny came in for, I think, the last 2 games that I was there for, and it wasn't really any different than it had been. She came in and pretty much did a hands-off observation for a couple of games just to see how the company worked. And then she came to the decision that there was kind of no saving it the way it was going, which was a valid business decision. That's when, after the end of Sea of Darkness, that's the dev and art teams got let go, and things have gone in a different direction. So.
Is that one? Because I actually don't know a lot about the current workings of the company, but I do know that they're doing some more explicitly educational stuff now. Is that when that started?
Yeah, so Codes and Clues was, it might have been in the works, like behind the scenes. It wasn't anything that the game dev team was working on. So yeah, that came out after the round of layoffs, but yeah, I don't know if the concept for it had already been kicking around, but
sure. Have you? Have you played that?
I have not.
No.
I think it's a fantastic idea, and I'm glad it's something that exists. But yeah, I haven't actually played it yet.
Yeah. Okay. So here's another question for you. How do you try to anticipate differences in playstyle during development? It's relatively easy to travel down multiple puzzle paths and just end up stuck by missing something in the middle. Are the hints the ultimate solution, or are there more subtle ways in game? More subtle ways, I guess, for directing players.
I think, at least conceptually, there are definitely more subtle ways that you can try to force players to look at specific things. And one of the things that we do in our games has to do with the character availability.
Mm-hmm.
And if all of a sudden someone's not there for you to talk to, and they're not there and not there and not there every time you go back to check, well, maybe that's a hint that you're supposed to do something in their area that you can only do when they're not there.
Right.
And you haven't done that thing yet.
Right.
Or you've reached the kind of end game state where it's supposed to be kind of a more time crunch, get you funneled into the end of the game, and none of the characters are there anymore.
Right.
Because they're not relevant anymore.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I like the way that the characters feel dynamic, especially because there is a structure to the Nancy Drew games that is around sort of exploring the space and trying to see when things change, when you can interact with things in a new way. And that often comes down for me to checking if there are new conversation options with all of the characters. And it's a lot easier for me to sort of keep that in the front of my mind when with the real like the live characters who are in the space, especially because they're animated, but they're moving around in that sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not. The ones that I tend to forget are the ones who are on the phone, who I always have access to, but because they're sort of virtual, I don't think of them in the same way.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we've kind of struggled with for a while was you go up and talk to someone and you get hi, bye.
Right.
And especially on the phone, that's super awkward because I deliberately called you just to hang up on you. And in Sea of Darkness, we're kind of prototyping and implemented a new early out thing where it would detect if there were not going to be any conversation options, and instead of going through a normal greet phase, it would give some sort of early outline where say, hey, you shouldn't be talking to me right now.
Yeah.
We're not going to have anything to say.
Got it. That's cool. That absolutely makes sense. That's a nice sort of incremental innovation on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the incremental improvements from game to game. And sometimes there's a massive shift, like with Tomb of the Lost Queen, where we did a resolution upshift and completely new user interface and everything. And then the differences between each game after that, it's like, okay, in Deadly Device, we actually implemented the ingrained hints integrated into the task list, and we added the inventory use hotspot, which I thought made the games infinitely more playable. All the times I've watched people playing, they've never really reacted to it being there or not.
Can you describe what that is? The inventory use hotspot.
Yeah. So hotspot is our terminology for the bounds on a screen that have interaction. When you mouse over them, your cursor changes, and when you click, it does something. So one of the cursors is the open hand with a little gear icon on it, and that symbolizes you're supposed to use an inventory item here.
Yeah. Yep.
It doesn't give you any hints at all as to what inventory item it is, but it's just this is where you're supposed to use a inventory item.
Yep.
And in previous games, in Tomb of the Lost Queen and prior, those inventory interaction hotspots would not even be interactable in any way unless you had the correct inventory item in your hand. And so, there could be a keyhole for a lock, and you think, oh, I'm supposed to use a key there. but unless you have the correct key in your hand, your cursor doesn't glow, your cursor doesn't change. You can't, if you click, nothing happens at all. And so there's no indication of, oh, did I just not have the correct inventory item?
Yeah.
Or logically, am I not supposed to be able to do this yet?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. I have definitely noticed that, but it is the kind of, the really low level feedback that it can be difficult to even call out. Like it is almost subconscious, but it absolutely does make a huge difference in the playability of the game.
Yeah, it just I remember doing some of my initial playthroughs of Tomb of the Lost Queen and some of the older games to kind of get myself up to speed on how the games work when I first started there. And looking back on it, that idea of not having any feedback as to, hey, this is where you're supposed to use an item.
Wow, yeah.
Was, unless you had the correct item in your hand, is just, why did we ever do it that way? That's,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's the kind of thing that once you sort of make that leap, once you sort of realize what the better system is and implement it, it might be almost invisible, but you sure as hell notice it going backward.
Yeah. And in Sea of Darkness, which is again the last game to come out, and so I think it actually is one of our best games. It has another new feature where it does something different with puzzle instructions, where when you go into a puzzle that you're able to solve, you still get some sort of Nancy line introducing it to you or telling you what the objective is. But if there are puzzle instructions, like how you actually interact with it, what the controls are,
sure,
the little task list window will be replaced with a block of text telling you what those instructions are.
Nice.
And because a lot of times in the puzzles, figuring out how the puzzle works isn't intended to be part of the difficulty of the puzzle.
Right.
Sometimes it is.
Right.
But in the vast majority of cases, it's not. Like with slider puzzles.
Sure.
You're not figuring out how to work a slider puzzle isn't meant to be the part of the difficulty of this puzzle. Those are common enough that it's kind of assumed that everyone kind of knows how they work. But if you had never seen a slider puzzle before, and you walked in, you opened one up, and the controls that we have in game can be really obtuse depending on which method we've done to give you feedback. This most recent one at least had the arrows that indicated which way a piece would slide.
Right.
Some of the past ones have been you just use the hand cursor and click on a tile adjacent to the empty one, and it will slide into the empty square.
Right.
But yeah, giving puzzle instructions is one of the things that seems like it should be dead easy, but is actually one of the most difficult challenges to get across.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel like it's... So Nancy Drew really, really tackles one of the biggest challenges in puzzle games head on, where we often, when we're working with students at USC, we often try to dissuade people from leaning too heavily into puzzle genres, because a lot of the time, every puzzle in the game is its own unique system that needs to be individually designed and implemented. And part of that is creating a user interface and a user experience that helps the player, that communicates how to actually interact with the puzzle. And if you have a bunch of different puzzles and they all work different ways, then you need to figure out how to communicate that for each individual one of those, which a lot of the time, under the time constraints that our students are working, that's just not feasible. And Nancy Drew does not shy away from that. Like, these games, you reuse some of the puzzle mechanics several times, but contain a bunch. Every one of them contains a bunch of very, very individual puzzles with very little overlap between them.
Right. And one of the major pitfalls is, again, with the Nancy Drew games especially, is there is a assumption that there's a certain level of familiarity with the way
Sure.
the games work, just in general, but also the way Nancy Drew puzzles tend to work.
Right.
Like most of them, especially the more modern ones, you generally don't have access to a puzzle until you can solve it, either until you know all the information you know, or you have all the pieces you need, or whatever. If you're not supposed to do the puzzle right now, you can't.
Yeah, and that's something I've noticed, especially in this game. There have been several times that I've encountered something that is obviously a puzzle, and that will show me, like, for example, the flower tile grid. Until I got that missing tile piece, the whole thing was sort of uninteractable, and it made it very clear that I'm not able to solve this yet. I should come back later when I have found some missing piece of it.
Yeah, and in fact, when I started watching the Shadow at Water's Edge playthrough, and when you guys got to the train and were able to get on without knowing what the possible destinations were, I was just face palming so hard, because it's like, you would not be able to do that anymore in a Nancy Drew game.
Right.
You would get a voiceover saying, I should figure out where I'm going first.
Right.
Before you were able to get on the train.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And, that would have saved some, like, headache and confusion in that moment of, holy cow, am I supposed to know what we're doing here? That's funny. Okay, so here's a question that just came up in the chat that I'm curious about. What sort of development and or design time is given per Nancy Drew game? How long was the dev cycle?
So each game was on a 6-month dev cycle. The art teams and the actual prod development team were staggered, so that the art team would finish on a game, a month and a half before the dev team would, and they would already be on to the next game.
Okay.
And only doing, bug fixing and polish on
Sure.
the game that was in progress now. The design and story elements were on more like kind of a year-long cycle, with 2 or 3 of them going simultaneously at any one time.
Got it.
And so our designer, I have no idea how she did it, but I mean, she had 3 fully fleshed out games in her head at any one time, and actually knew them all and could answer questions about all of them without getting lost.
That's cool.
I mean, it was pretty incredible.
Yeah, that's some specialized skills that she must have developed. That's wild.
Yeah, because the dev cycle in games, it's it's kind of a linear path where you have to have the story concept first before you can start on anything, and then you have to have your environmental concepts, and then your artist can start in on that. And for us as production programmers, until we had art, there was practically nothing we could do, because our main job was integrating the art into the engine.
Right.
And so without the art being there,
right,
there was nothing to integrate. And so in our 6-month dev cycle, it was more like 4.5, 5 months we're building the current game, and then a month and a half at the start we're doing in between game projects like engine optimizations, or if we had system upgrades that we wanted to do, like doing the new integrated hints. That's one of the things that would happen in between games.
That would go in between games. Huh.
Yeah.
Wow. 6 months seems like a really quick turnaround. Did it feel like that?
It definitely felt quick. From my end, it didn't feel rushed or that it was crunched at all. I imagine if you ask the art team, they might have a very different answer.
Okay, sure.
Especially the character animation team, they might have a very different answer.
Okay.
Because that was always our time constraint was pretty much always art. It's how much art can the team get out during this short a dev cycle? Because the integration stuff on our end was easy and pretty dead simple. And we had a very good idea of how much dev time we could fit in to dedicate to puzzles. And so like our designer basically was given a budget. Hey, you have 45 days worth of dev time for puzzles. And then we would go through and say, this is a 3-day puzzle. This is a 2-day puzzle. This is a 5-day puzzle. And she got to basically pick and choose and fill up her budget for which puzzles she wanted in the game. And it was just, but by the time I started working there, it was such a well-oiled machine. Then they had such a good idea of how much content could get made in that short dev cycle that it wasn't really problematic in any way.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what number Nancy Drew game this is, or how many total there were?
Labyrinth of Lies was 31, and Sea of Darkness was 32.
Wow. I mean, yeah, like at that point, the people involved have had a lot of practice doing what they're doing.
And there were more than a few employees that had actually been there from the very beginning. So.
Wow. That's incredible. That really is. I have to say, like, 6 months sounds to me like a fast turnaround, but none of the games that I've played have felt rushed in any kind of an overall way. Sometimes, like, there are moments that feel a little bit rough, but overall, the level of polish on all of these games is really stunning to think that it happens that quickly, that it like all comes together like that.
Yeah, the bigger constraint we always had, more so in just time, was in our studio time for getting voiceover recorded. Because for the animated conversations, in fact, all of the character conversations, the other person that Nancy is talking to, they had one studio day. And there were no callbacks, there were no pickups later on. They had one day, and they went through the whole script and recorded it. And then that's what we had on their side. Nancy would do 3 or sometimes 4 recording sessions. So you would often get these kind of awkward situations where, okay, we need to communicate this thing to the player. We can make a Nancy line and try and find some other character dialogue, then kind of force it to work. And because the script, is written and finalized relatively early, and the first couple of recording sessions happen relatively early, and then the game design side of it, the game logic of it, changes and morphs as the game gets built.
Sure.
And as you test it and find, well, okay, people are getting stuck here, this isn't really working, and the only kind of tools we had to address those things were Nancy lines, or putting in text assets somewhere.
And would those text assets, if you had to resort to that, would that generally be somehow integrated into the world, or were those like UI?
In that case, they would probably be put. The desire would be to put them into a written asset in the world somewhere.
Okay, yeah.
An inventory item that you would find and pick up. Because putting them in the UI, it's way too easy for players to miss them. Yeah, in the current UI, there's your task list, but you also have the notes tab,
Right.
And that's where the kind of game critical observations go.
Right.
Which I think you might have looked at once.
Yep. I think I looked at exactly
in the 3
once.
days.
Yeah.
There's
probably some important stuff in there that I should look at again.
Yeah, and sometimes Nancy will write things down because they are important and game critical, and the player didn't realize they were game critical when they first discovered them. And,
but I imagine that I am not the only player who then doesn't quickly think to look there for information that I may have missed.
Probably. Sure,
am I the only player?
Not the only player.
Okay. All right.
I think there is kind of an assumption, again, to kind of the literacy and how you play Nancy Drew games, that going to look for information in your notes is something you do.
That's kind of a Nancy Drew thing. Like if I was more experienced playing Nancy Drew games, if I was more of a sort of Nancy Drew veteran, I would have that instinct drilled into me a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? I mean, I'm really curious because you've made this comment a couple of times, and maybe you've said all that you have to say about it. But I love the idea that I'm not the target audience for this game, and I'm not the target audience specifically because of that legacy. That there's a tendency for your players in these games to be people who are pretty familiar with the Nancy Drew titles, and that allows you to kind of take some not shortcuts, but to assume some literacy on their part. Is it interesting to watch somebody play who is perhaps adept at some of the types of puzzles that are in these games, but not at a lot of the things that are specific to Nancy Drew?
It's definitely very interesting, and that's why, Shadow at War's Edge on Mostly Walking was also so fascinating to watch, because, Sean Plott is very good at most games he plays.
Right.
And he likes to get into it and figure out how games work and become very good at them. And with Nancy Drew, there's so many things that you're kind of just expected to know by experience of having played previous games that you won't really pick up on immediately. And also, like, playing your first game on Senior, especially in that era of games where Senior didn't get a task list.
Yeah.
In the modern era, Senior still gets a task list. It's pared down and it doesn't have hints, but there's still a task list.
There's something. Okay, yeah.
And that was it would have been such a different experience having played on Junior than on Senior.
No, absolutely.
And so that was really interesting to watch, kind of the fallout of that gut choice of, we can handle hard mode.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. That's really, really interesting. And I mean, I think that choice is definitely born out of the fact that Sean is an experienced gamer, and he is, in capital letters, good at games, and sort of has an expectation that for any given game, he will be able to master it. It's interesting to think about this as a game that, really it relies on a set of skills that are learned over over the course of the franchise. and that are not immediately accessible to somebody who might otherwise consider themselves like good at games.
Yeah, and it's the legacy is something that, one, it's very easy to get tripped up on and to assume literacy when there isn't any, and that can really get you into trouble. And also, I think the legacy was, in some ways, it was a huge problem as well, because there wasn't a desire to approach designing the games to reach a wider audience or to bring in a new player base.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when we did the UI overhaul in Tomb of the Lost Queen, and sent out surveys to our beta testers of what do you think of the new UI, and the results were fairly mixed. There was a very significant amount of people who liked the old UI better just because it's what they were used to. It was familiar, and if you look at the two side by side, I mean, from any kind of objectable measurement, the new UI is so much better.
Right.
It's so much more user-friendly and so much more accessible in every way you can categorize, pretty much. And yet a bunch of our player base is like, the old one was better.
Yeah, that familiarity bias is killer. I mean, that is really... I didn't think about that. I have thought a lot about a lot of the really cool aspects of working on this kind of franchise where you are doing incremental upgrades every game. I think that like affords a lot of really cool potential in understanding how people play the games and how to make them better, and to do those things, to roll those out on sort of a wide scale as you go forward. But I haven't really thought about what must be a very real problem of when you make changes to underlying functionality or interface or anything that the players experience as familiar. There has to be at least some kind of a backlash to that, because people don't like that. Huh.
Yeah, and I mean, in the player base, I mean, there's a huge nostalgia feel for how the old games were better.
Sure.
And
that's interesting. Yeah.
I'm quite biased because I actually worked on the new games.
Right.
In that I think that the newer games are quite good, and from a game design play standpoint, I think they're much more playable and much more user-friendly. Because some of the old games had some downright hostile mechanics in them, like in Shadow at the Water's Edge, where you had a dialogue line where if you picked it, you died.
Right.
And then it never went away. It was always there. You just always had to remember, oh, that's the one I can't ever ask. And that was so foreign to have in a game too. I think that's the only game that had it.
Right.
And because one of the Nancy Drew literacy things is you ask about everything.
Right.
Because almost everything that you can ask about is game critical.
Right.
It sets a logic flag that if you don't, you're not going to be able to progress.
Right. No, absolutely. So I'm encountering a situation right now. I mean, it's fun for me I feel like I am actively developing this literacy in Nancy Drew games. I feel like, I am better at playing this than I was at Thornton Hall. And clearly there are still things that I am like that haven't become instinctual, or I still don't like see the way that a more adept player would. But I can see myself making decisions or approaching things differently than I would have if this were my first game. And so that's kind of neat for me on my end to be seeing. But I'm experiencing this really cool, weird moment right now where I have this one dialogue option left in the whole of the current content of the game, the state of the game, that I feel like I'm not supposed to choose from a narrative standpoint, but from a game structure mechanical standpoint, it it feels really strange to leave something unasked, because that is very much the pattern of these games, is ask about everything. And I actually feel like I'm quite certain that it would be innocuous and probably funny if I asked it, but from a narrative standpoint, I feel like I should avoid saying that thing.
Yeah, and that's one of the other pitfalls that it can be really easy to fall into is that, Nancy is a very well established character, and people have very clear pictures in their heads as to who
Mm.
Nancy is and what her
Mm-hmm.
personality is. And so, in some of the games where we've had little bits of Nancy being perhaps a bit snarky, um, there have been complaints that Nancy doesn't do that. That's not Nancy. She would never ask that, or she would never sound like that if she did have to ask
Right.
it. And
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's absolutely true. I don't know why I hadn't thought about that, but like Nancy is not only a character who is established objectively by the fiction of the game. She's a character that is like really well known outside of the fiction of any of these games. She's a beloved character just in sort of in literature and in people's childhoods.
yeah, yeah, and that's why the Silent Spy game was such a mixed bag because on the one hand, I mean, from a gameplay point of view, I think it was a really solid, reliable Nancy Drew game in what the mystery was, what the mechanics were, how it was structured. Um, in content, though, it tackled a very emotional subject, which is Nancy's mother. And uh, people have different beliefs on canonically what Nancy's mother was or did, or how old Nancy was when she died. I mean, the only kind of accepted thing is Nancy's mom died at some point in her childhood.
Got it.
And so there were a lot of people that were kind of predisposed to not want to like the Silent Spy just because of, well, this isn't the correct interpretation of Nancy's mom.
Yeah. Oh wow, wow! What a minefield.
Yeah, but
Huh.
I am very proud of that game, and I think it's one of the certainly one of the most emotional and definitely one of the best stories we've told.
Cool.
Um,
Well, that's fantastic. That's awesome. All right. I want to get to one more question, I think, before we wrap this up. 'Cause this is an interesting one. It's directed at me, but I would like to hear your thoughts on it. What are your thoughts on the pacing of the game? The first week seemed more story or plot point focused with a few puzzles. This week feels like it's just all puzzles almost. Which is an interesting observation, and one that I would push back on a little bit, if only because this week in this session, like all of the stuff with Thanos has happened, and that feels like it is an enormous amount of maybe not plot progress, but like really important plot context that changes a lot of how I think about what's going on in the world of this game. Um, but it did kind of come a little bit at a rush. Uh, and I do think that the first hour or 2 hours that I played of Labyrinth of Lies were pretty light on puzzles, or at least light on the kinds of puzzles that I think of Nancy Drew games as sort of having like those meaty physical logic puzzles. It was more I think about the post-it note on the drawer, or I guess there were some like really narratively driven um like there was some like reading through documentation in order to pick out salient facts puzzles, which are interesting in their own way, but not. I think of them as sort of a separate category from things like the the sliding tiles and jewels, or the rotating roses and leaves sorts of puzzles. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts or insights into the narrative structure and pacing of the game. Is there a deliberate attempt to introduce different types of puzzles at different points?
In some ways there is. Pacing is one of the biggest challenges in the Nancy Drew games, because ultimately there is a linear critical path that you have to follow from beginning to end. And like right now, you are at one of the choke points where until you progress along the critical path, nothing else is going to open up. And once you do get past that critical path blocker, a whole bunch of stuff is likely to open up for you to do.
Right.
Because it's a mostly linear game that tries to pretend to be non-linear by giving the player choices in how they tackle certain things. And so it runs into the problem of, well, if a player plays in a sort of completionist fashion, they might reach the state where at endgame it's just puzzle, 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 puzzle with nothing distracting from it. And I mean, pacing is one of the hardest things to do right in any game, period.
Yeah.
In any story, period.
Right.
And in games more so, because so much of the pacing is up to the player. And it's really interesting to think about pacing in the era of Let's Plays and Twitch and live streaming, because a player can be playing through and be at a very tense moment in the game, and then turn in monologue to the camera for 35 minutes about something that they just thought of.
A hypothetical person. Yeah.
Yes. Sure. Yes. Completely hypothetical.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are steps, like in most of the Nancy Drew games, especially towards the end, there are steps to kind of encourage you along in the pacing of you're approaching end game.
Right.
There's very few things for you to do. We're going to try to winnow it down even further for you. But yeah, I mean, pacing is hard.
Yeah, I mean, I feel good about what I've played of Labyrinth of Lies so far. I think for me, like, the only time that pacing really becomes a conscious issue is when I feel like when I like feel really stuck, when I get to one of those choke points where I feel like I've exhausted all of the things that I'm supposed to do and all of the ancillary things that I have access to, that I'm aware of, and there's something that is holding me back, and it's the thing that I sort of haven't figured out or haven't seen. And I've definitely seen that moment come up in all of the Nancy Drew games that I've played, but much less so in this game. I feel like at this moment is the first time that I really feel stuck. That I really feel like I've exhausted all of the stuff that is on my mind. And so now I'm really not sure what to do next. And that's when I feel like the game kind of grinds to a halt. almost all of the other times, like all of the other cases, even if the narrative of the game has a level of tension or sort of implicit pacing to it, it doesn't feel like discontinuous as long as I can keep making some kind of forward progress, even if I slow down or I am not making like leaps and bounds forward. As long as I'm able to sort of push things forward or see where I should be pushing things forward, it never, like, the idea of that pacing really never occurs to me as a problem.
Yeah, and that's why it was really interesting when you played through Ghosts of Thornton Hall that you hit kind of the major mine that was in that game of the cell phone being a critical path blocker that
Right.
also happened to be one of the very, very few things in the entire franchise that had a real life timer attached to it. It's like you solve the puzzle and in 5 minutes you'll be able to progress. And
Right.
if you were at the point like you were, where this was literally the only thing you had left to do, you just got to sit there and wait.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah, that is interesting. That's interesting that, I mean, presumably that's not a common player behavior, that like most people would have found themselves in a position where they had other things to do to let that timer expire.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, can I ask you one last question that is not your department whatsoever, but the cover image for this game is super suggestive, like, right?
Yeah.
Is that it? Should we not talk about this until I've played the whole game? Like, is there stuff that's going to happen later that is going to make that make more sense to me?
Well, so the cover art is a really interesting thing, because basically, that was something that was contracted out to another company to do, and it was basically, the design team came together and told them, the concept of the game, and then gave a list of, here are the things that you cannot put on the cover because it's too spoilery.
Sure.
And then they sent back an image, and this is what we got. And
is there? I mean, do you feel like this is not? I mean, was there no room in the production cycle to have, like, sort of sent this back and gotten changes, or is this what they were looking for?
I think it was kind of a mixture of both. I know that there was, and a definite intention to have the pomegranate be featured, and I do actually remember in the initial teaser for Labyrinth of Lies that was at the end of the Shattered Medallion. The initial rendering of it, I watched through it after putting it into the game and immediately sent an email off to our creative director. It's like, why is there a dead beating heart sitting on a chair? Because it was supposed to be a pomegranate, but
right.
That's not what it looked like, at least to me.
Right. No, absolutely. Okay. I mean, that's super interesting. I think I'm gonna revisit this when I get further into the game. I mean, it's beautiful artwork. Like, I have no problems with the artwork. I think it's really lovely and intriguing. It just, in a number of ways, is seems like, suggestive. It is suggestive of a number of things that are not immediately what I associate with the Nancy Drew franchise or with this game specifically.
Right.
Um,
And I mean, it's definitely the Persephone myth is kind of the core feature of this game. You know, it's the core element that everything else is kind of wrapped around. Yeah, and that's what we have.
Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I honestly don't want to I don't want to pull it apart too much without having gotten through the rest of the narrative. So I think it's a good thing to come back to later. Harrison, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. This has been fascinating for me, and really absolutely a pleasure.
Yeah, and I know we didn't get to actually get to very many of the questions that were submitted. I'm more than happy to answer any of those on the forums as well.
So. That is super kind of you. Thank you so much. Yeah, there were a bunch of questions, and we absolutely did not get to all of them.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. So anybody watching who is interested in learning more about behind the scenes at Nancy Drew, check out the forum. Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. This has been a joy. Okay, I'm gonna just wrap up here. Thank you everybody for being here tonight, and going through this section of Labyrinth of Lies. This has been super fun. I feel like after last week's sort of discovery of the underbelly of the theater and all of that entailed, this week was really a lot of revelation about the characters who populate this world, and I feel like it is all building to a pretty dramatic head. So I'm excited to come back to this game. I think we're going to play this again for the next couple of weeks, and see how far that takes us into the game. But it should be a lot of fun, and I will see you next week. So thank you to everybody who's in the chat on Twitch, and if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like the video if you liked it, and dislike it if you didn't. And would appreciate if you leave a comment below to let us know what you thought about Labyrinth of Lies and my naivete when it comes to Nancy Drew games. And make sure that you're subscribed so you get notifications when new videos go up. And follow me on twitch.tv/ifandef if you want to catch the show live. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you next week.